Pope Francis was open to criticism. He was open to constructive engagement. He was open to dialogue. And this is part of his legacy.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. In this episode, Acton librarian Dan Huger speaks with Stephen Barrows, Chief Operating Officer at the Acton Institute, and John Pinheiro, Director of Research at the Acton Institute, about the life and legacy of Pope Francis. This wide-ranging conversation covers Pope Francis's perspectives on the market, the environment, liturgy, synodality, business, ecumenicism, and the poor. Which parts of Pope Francis's legacy will endure, and what was his contribution to the life of the Catholic Church? You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I am joined by Stephen Barrows, Chief Operating Officer at the Acton Institute, and John Pinheiro, Director of Research at the Acton Institute. Today is a sad day. On Easter Monday, Pope Francis died at the Vatican's Casa Santa Marta. A day after, he appeared in his wheelchair to bless the faithful in St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday. May he rest in peace. John has co-authored with Michael Matheson Miller a moving tribute to Pope Francis, Requiem Aeternium, Pope Francis, published in Religion and Liberty Online on Monday. Last month, Stephen published an excellent essay, Pope Francis's Plea for Migrants and the Acton Institute's Core Principles, also at Religion and Liberty Online. We'll be touching on both of those pieces as we remember the life and reflect on the legacy of Pope Francis. Gentlemen, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
There has been a lot of commentary on the passing of Pope Francis already, and there's going to be much, much more. But I think the opening paragraphs of The Economist's obituary captures most of the world's, both Catholics and non-Catholics, initial introduction to Pope Francis the best. The moment when the great doors of St. Peter's balcony swing open, announcing a new pope, seems to call for trumpets and drums. Instead, on March 13th, 2013, the figure in white said, "Good evening." Though he spoke in Italian, his parents' language, he was an Argentinian, the first non-European pope for almost 13 centuries. That in itself was interesting, but before the traditional Urbi et Orbi blessing, he asked the huge crowd for their blessings on him. Interest turned to patient surprise. Francis did not stop there. There would be no papal cape or red slippers, just a plain white cassock and his ordinary black shoes. He would as happily have worn the shirt of his football club, San Lorenzo, or his national blue and white with Messi, his favorite player, on the back. No crest-embellished dinner plates, no new pectoral cross. He kept the iron-plated one he had worn from 1998 as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. No 12-room apartment in the Vatican, but a 2-room suite in the guests' hostel, and meals in the dining room with everyone else. "We'll see how long it lasts," said one aide, uncomfortable. It lasted until he died. For in Buenos Aires, after all, he had cooked his own meals and traveled by bus. Humility did not drive these changes. For him, ostentatious displays of sanctity were osteoporosis of the soul. He just wanted to be among the people, out in the open, with his flock. In the Vatican apartment, he would have been alone. In the bulletproof Popemobile, which he also discarded, he would have been unable to hug, embrace, and give himself to selfies, tickle children and laugh with besotted nuns. From the hostel, too, he could sneak out with little formality, turning up at hospitals, prisons, and hospices to the huge surprise of inmates and workers. On Holy Thursday, he visited such places to kneel before people in trouble, wash their feet, towel them dry, and kiss them. Good shepherds, he said, should get their hands dirty. We'll include in the show notes the rest of that obituary. There's some other things in that obituary that will come up. But that was my introduction to Francis, as I remember it. He was sort of an unexpected pope. This wasn't the consensus. We've got a lot of prognosticators today saying, 6-to-1 odds on so-and-so and the rest of it. But the Spirit moves as it wills. And it moved in a very particular direction in 2013 that surprised us all. And Francis has had a surprising papacy in many ways. It's been disorienting for many people. It's been exciting for many people. It's been, all things to all men. If we're going to think about this in biblical categories, but it's a very strange time in the church because it's a time of mourning, but it's also a time of reflection. And we're going to try to do both of those things here this afternoon as we talk about this. And John, you and Michael Matheson Miller wrote a very moving tribute and reflection on Pope Francis's life and legacy. And, that's a challenging thing to do when you're called upon to do these things. And how did you and Michael sort of think through that and what you wanted to say and how you wanted to say it?
Well, we have the great benefit, of course, Michael and I do, of working in the same building most days when he's not out working on the new film about poverty. And so we had already had many, many discussions about Pope Francis before. And so when it was obvious that we would want to produce a eulogy, I started writing it. And then in conversations with Michael, he had a few ideas. And what we wanted to do with it was this. We knew that there would be those who were ready to canonize Francis before he was even buried. And then we knew that many of those would actually be in the secular media and those on the political left who thought somehow they had a compadre in Pope Francis. And then there would be those on the traditionalist side of the Catholic spectrum who hadn't liked him in a long time, and maybe they would just, unload both barrels on him. So we thought while we had and have prudential disagreements with Francis, particularly on the value of markets, for example, and while we might not be, while we're certainly not happy with how some of his pronouncements and Vatican pronouncements actually muddied the moral clarity that we need rather than clarifying it, we thought at this point what you do is accentuate the most positive things about Francis's legacy, and what that means for a pope is to tie him in continuity with previous pontiffs. And so what we wanted to emphasize was, for example, Francis is very much known as the Green Pope, but before this Green Pope, there was another Green Pope.
There was.
And that was Cardinal Ratzinger. That is Benedict XVI, and that is what folks called him. And the very conservative admirers of Ratzinger in America often forget that. But Ratzinger was very much a voice against climate change, and he talked about ecology, but he talked about it in a holistic sense, particularly in Caritas in Veritate, as human ecology being tied to natural ecology. And we actually find that very much with Francis, even in Laudato Si, which is not always clear in every part, right? We find him tying the dignity of the human person to his natural environment. And I'll just quote Laudato Si quickly here. So if we accept our bodies as a gift, as God's gift, that's vital to welcoming and accepting the entire world as a gift. But when we think that we enjoy absolute power over our bodies, that turns often subtly into thinking we enjoy absolute power over creation. And that absolute power over creation was actually the creation of the scientific people like Bacon, who coined that phrase, knowledge is power. And he meant power over nature.
Yeah, and there are commentators, even non-Catholic commentators, who have found these tensions. As I was preparing for this episode, I was looking, there's an old piece of National Review called Francis and the Greens by Yuval Levin, where he points out this tension where with those with ears to hear, you not only hear echoes of the environmental movement, but a correction of its excesses and an attempt to take those environmental concerns and address them in a way that is grounded in who the human person is and in God's created order. Stephen, what were your thoughts as we're called upon to address these things all the time, and you recently did this wonderful essay on migration and Pope Francis, and how do you think through that legacy?
When you started off describing and reading from The Economist obituary and reflection on Francis, I was very consistent with some of the things that I had brought up in his view towards migrants. And that is, Francis always had a disposition of being a pope of the people. So he didn't really embrace sort of the pomp that typically comes with the papacy. Of course, a lot of that diminished quite dramatically after Vatican II, but he even, took it further. Dismissing all of the things that you described about just the pomp surrounding the office. And he really emphasized himself as a pope of the people. And I think that naturally then formed and shaped his perspective on migration. When he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he was known to just ride on the subway and just very discreet, clothing and just being in the midst of the people and people who were poor and just the ordinary persons. And so, when he reflects on what he experienced in his time in Argentina, I think one of the things that strikes me about Francis is that he did understand that there are people who are on the peripheries that just don't get into the wonderful aspects of our modern world that works for the vast majority of people. So, John had mentioned, sometimes we have some reservations and disagreements with some say how the Pope didn't have quite a positive view of markets. And I think probably it's because he saw certain things in his experience as a priest and bishop in Argentina that made him realize that there are many people who don't experience markets the way, say, we do in the United States and all the benefits that are derived from them. And so he would emphasize those on the peripheries. And of course, a great category of people on the peripheries are those who are fleeing circumstances that aren't working for them, and they're trying to find ways to help their families and improve their own conditions, and they see the best way to do that is to go places where prosperity reigns, and so they migrate.
Yeah, this attitude towards markets, in John, in your and Michael's piece, you cite Pope John Paul II in Centesimus Annis, where,
Right.
We take it for granted because we're at the Acton Institute and we're in dialogue with both theologians and economists. We take for granted certain definitions that other people don't necessarily come to the table with. And in Centesimus Annis, Pope St. John Paul II says, if capitalism is meant a system in which freedom in the economic sector is not circumscribed within a strong juridical framework, which places it at the service of human freedom in its totality, and which sees it as a particular aspect of that freedom, the core of which is ethical religious, then the reply is certainly negative. So that when we talk about markets, we're not. This is not merely, there are bad business practices. There is crony capitalism. There is, frankly, in the words of Frederick Bastiat, there is privilege. There is monopoly. There are all of these terrible things, which serve to exclude people from the economy and from society. And Pope Francis, Robert Waples edited a very fine book from the Acton Institute called Pope Francis and the Caring Society. He came to Acton here and gave a great discussion of it. It was actually one of the last things that Michael Novak wrote was the foreword to that book, in which he gets into dialogue with Pope Francis. But Robert Waples' introduction to that book sort of tries to translate Pope Francis's economic concerns into the language of economists. And he tries to do so in a very charitable way, and tries to bring them in dialogue. And I think that's one of the things that we strive to do. It's not wholly a product of criticism. And Pope Francis himself was open to this sort of inquiry. He released not too long ago, in 2024, letter of His Holiness Pope Francis on the role of literature in formation, which is a fantastic, interesting read for all sorts of reasons. But item 20 in there gets to this point where he says, when I think of literature, I am reminded of the great Argentinian writer Jorge Luis Borges. He used to tell his students, namely, that the most important thing is to simply read, to enter into direct contact with literature, to immerse oneself in the living text in front of us, rather than to fixate on ideas and critical comments. Borges explained this idea to his students by saying that at first they may understand very little of what they are reading, but in any case they are hearing another person's voice. This is a definition of literature that I very much like, listening to another person's voice. We must never forget how dangerous it is to stop listening to the voice of other people when they challenge us. We immediately fall into self-isolation. We enter a kind of spiritual deafness which has a negative effect on our relationship with ourselves and our relationship to God, no matter how much theology or psychology we may have studied, or how little economics. Pope Francis was open to criticism. He was open to constructive engagement. He was open to dialogue. And this is part of his legacy. And we tried to do our part to bring those sort of distinctions, to acknowledge, the place and limits of markets, but also their central role in bringing prosperity, and integral human development to peoples all over the world.
Yeah, as Michael and I say in the eulogy, the things that create the conditions for human flourishing that Francis desires are best created and grounded in things like the rule of law and respect for private property and all those things that make markets possible and encourage the kind of virtues that you need for markets, but also the kind of virtues that come out of engaging in a commercial market economy. And unfortunately, what Francis did was conflate the kind of capitalism, which, by the way, John Paul goes on to say, let's not call it capitalism. Let's call it the free economy or the business economy. He has some other terminology for it. I don't know anyone at Acton Institute that would use the term capitalism except in a negative sense.
Yeah.
And we know who coined the phrase, right?
We do.
Karl Marx. So, but on the other hand, Francis also recognized, and I'll read a sentence here from his pronouncement to French entrepreneurs. This
Yes.
was 2 or 3 years ago, and a lot of people missed this because it wasn't translated into English in most places. But he was speaking to French entrepreneurs, and he said, it's impossible to imagine any improvement in the common good without considering entrepreneurs as actors in development and well-being. And then he tells them, you're an essential driver of wealth, prosperity, and public happiness. And I guess what we do then is simply we connect that vocation of entrepreneurship in a way that's propositional and not impositional. And I will not refer to interlocutors in any argument as anti-market fundamentalists, but I also do wish that I wouldn't be called a market fundamentalist, including by Pope Francis, because I'm not, and I don't really. I know some people who are, and they're libertarians who wouldn't quite fit in what we're talking about here in Centesimus Annus, for example.
Mm-hmm. So one of the important ways to think about Pope Francis's legacy is talking about these issues of what does the business economy look like? What does a market economy look like? What should the church's concerns be with that? And that's part of his legacy, and that's one that's mixed. There are positive appraisals of business, as John, you pointed out. There's positive appraisals, inconsistently of markets in Francis's social teaching, but there's also criticism, some of which are grounded, as Steve pointed out, in very real shortcomings of the way that markets operate in many places of the world that are not ordered to the common good, that allow for this sort of cronyism and exploitation. But there are other parts of Pope Francis's legacy that are worth considering too. One of those big points that was sort of a lightning rod these last few years of his papacy were liturgical issues. I've never attended the Tridentine Rite Mass, the extraordinary form, as it used to be called.
Do you now, or have you ever attended a traditional? Yes, it sounds familiar.
So this was something that didn't touch me personally, but touched very many people that I know personally, and was a frustration that many people had with Pope Francis, and was one that I was sympathetic with because the church is one of diverse liturgical rites. It still is. There are Eastern Rite churches. There are Syro-Malabar rites in the church. There are other, there's an Ambrosian rite. John and I were talking about this morning. We were talking about, that, even popes themselves often come out of liturgical traditions that are not the ordinary form of the Roman rite. As we're reflecting on his legacy, what do you both make of this liturgical legacy of Francis on this question, and maybe on broader elements of the liturgy, if you think there's any lasting legacy there?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. First, it is a very significant change from what Pope Benedict had done during his papacy, which is significantly liberalize the traditional Latin Mass and encourage people to take use and benefit from that, both forms, the extraordinary and the ordinary form of the Mass. I think one of the things that puzzled me about the whole thing is that this was the outcome of a worldwide survey of bishops, and then they gathered the data from that survey. And as I recall, reading Traditionis Custodes, which was the document that the Pope issued to suppress much of the use of the Latin Mass, he said that it's become clear that although Benedict XVI had desired to have this be mutually beneficial, to have these two rites together, that it actually became a source of extra division and exploitation among those who loved that ancient rite. And so right off the bat, you have sort of an empirical justification that based on what had happened and what had transpired. It would be great to actually see some of the results of those surveys. Not that I'm distrusting the Pope's assessment of what came in, but perhaps it was excessively pessimistic, or maybe he got a synopsis that was excessively pessimistic, because I'm sure he didn't read all the surveys himself, right? Yep. And so, you wonder whether or not the advice that he got from those who were consolidating all of those surveys was accurate. And I guess the other question in my mind is, it became, as I understand it, even more severely regulated than it had been prior to Benedict XVI's liberalization, where under John Paul II, he had, after the Lefebvre Schism of 1988, he had opened up some options for the Latin Rite and really delegated to the bishops the discernment of whether or not to permit it within their own dioceses and encourage them to do so. And it seems like Francis went more in the other direction, even restricting the ability to the bishops to be free to make those judgment calls. So I guess that's one thing when I talk to folks that love that ancient rite, they're puzzled by why there isn't more trust in the delegation of the bishops. And so we have to, just at this stage, I suppose, just trust the judgment of Pope Francis on this matter and know that in the long run it's going to work out. So
I guess I'm less sanguine than Steve on this. I also don't attend the traditional Latin Mass, the 1962 missal of the Latin Mass. One of the Pope's callings, as described by the Church herself, is to be a source of unity, a sign of unity, a cause for unity among the bishops. And so what was especially puzzling for me was that John Paul II and Benedict XVI would make these efforts to accommodate those Catholics who, for a variety of reasons, prefer that Roman rite and the old Latin rite. And I think one of the things that survey must have shown is that these aren't people in their 70s and 80s; they're people in their 20s and 30s. They're young people, they're huge families. But why would you intentionally, when you don't need to, create division in your own church and alienate some of the most devout families and Catholics and parishes that you have? And why would you do it in a way that's not synodal? Yeah. And doesn't match up to subsidiarity, but is very much top down all the way from the Vatican? And the answers I can come up with are this, and that this was partly Pope Francis's rationale, that the traditional Latin Mass was more of a signal by some that they rejected Vatican II, that Vatican II was a rupture. And Pope Benedict had, of course, preached continuity and talked about continuity and tried to show that in the way he governed the church and treated the Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo, etc. But that was actually a rupture. Now, that might be true of some who attend the Latin Mass. And I've heard it from their own lips before that the Novus Ordo is awful, and here's why the old way's better, and these were all the mistakes. But I've also heard people in suburban parishes who think that somehow there was 500 years of Latin mistakes and a horror story of a liturgy until the late 1960s, and that's just not true either. So I would agree with Steve on the principle that there's room for a lot of rites in the Catholic Church. I would think there'd be room for a couple of different Roman rites. It's just a matter of maybe there's a better way to address some of the concerns than the way they were addressed. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
So this brings up one of the tensions of another theme of Pope Francis's papacy, this synodality. Because this was something that, on the one hand, was the result of this sort of deliberative process, that there were survey results. That wasn't an entirely transparent process. It was sort of an opaque process, and it resulted in a top-down decision from the various highest levels of the church. So in one sense, it's informed in a bottom-up way, but in the other sense, it's very top-down. This is Lester de Coster, who is a Reformed theologian, became very critical in his later years of the Christian Reformed Church, and he talked about a synodocracy, where independent local churches within the Christian Reformed Church, when every issue was brought up to the synod, and there had to be a whole vote for the whole denomination, and all of this was then imposed on the top down on all of these congregations. And that's a danger of this sort of synodality too. Is there is definitely in the Second Vatican Council, there's an emphasis on trying to exercise subsidiarity more like the ancient church did. What we saw throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period was a gradual centralization of power, either under the Pope himself, or often and many times in the monarchies of Catholic nations. I mean, this is what we want in the church is a church that is free to govern itself, and for the people of God to play a real role in that governance. And that's Pope Francis's impetus behind this movement of synodality. But we've seen at least one way in which that has gone, that has missed the mark, and that doesn't seem to be a genuine reflection of his ambition for this project. What did you both make of the sort of synodality as a project in the church, and how do you assess it so far, and what does the future look like for that? This could be something that is a very big part of Pope Francis's legacy.
Sure. So just a couple of reflections on what I thought. So I guess a couple of things. One, there's obviously, as a Catholic myself, we believe in a revealed religion. And so the doctrines that come from God about who he is and his plan for salvation are fixed, unchangeable. They're, for all eternity. And, Pope Francis kept reassuring this is not about changing those revelations. Okay. Yep. And so he really wanted it to be a implementation of his desire to be a listening church that reaches out to the peripheries and really gets to the people and find out what their needs are. So that's all great in terms of an idea and a direction to go. How it's being implemented, I think one of the risks I am concerned about is that whenever you have a process like this, you have different levels of motivation, right, on the ground. So I'll just take my own family and then people in my circle. Frankly, we are so caught up in the day-to-day life, life experiences, what we do, living out our faith, living out our vocation in the world, that we really don't have time to invest, and nor do I have any real strong incentive to invest because I don't have any particular things at stake. I just accept the church's teaching and then run with it as best I can. There are others who probably very much do need to have an outlet to have their voice heard in ways that they haven't before. But what I'm concerned about is the third group of people, the people that really do not like what the church is from a revealed religion dimension, right? And they see this as their opportunity, and they don't believe, perhaps, that these things are are immutable, and therefore they leverage this to say, this is our opportunity to change the church in ways that wouldn't. Now, of course, as a Catholic, I don't think it's ever going to change, right? Mm-hmm. So it's going to be a failed effort by those activists. But it just gives that opportunity, which then creates confusion, right? So the people who think, oh, maybe those are up for grabs, these historic teachings. Yep. And so that's the one risk. At the same time, Francis made it clear we've got to take some risks. We've got to make a mess if we're going to be able to reach the peripheries. So there's trade-offs. I'm an economist. You're going to always hear me speak about the trade-offs.
Yeah. Yeah, John, what are your thoughts on this synodal project?
So the synod, if I'm right about this, started with Paul VI. And this was to be a synod of bishops to advise the Pope on certain matters. It's a way of keeping in touch with dioceses around the world and the diversity of countries and languages and peoples that are part of the church. The implication of the synod on synodality was to talk about synodality itself. I think, as Francis Meyer wrote just this past week, I would agree with him that this is a very manipulable project. It's a very manipulable project, and that is, as Steve was talking about, that third group of people. So imagine, if you will, you're living in this democratic age where everybody wants their opinion heard 24/7. You tweet it out, you put it on social media. Somebody says something really introspective, complicated, and nuanced, and your response is an emoji. This is the kind of age we live in. Yeah. And so the idea that, the church is just really out of step with modern times. And you take sort of that little bit of flavor of St. John the 23rd, or the sense of opening up the windows of the church, and you take that, what you turn it into is we want to make the church match the secular world as it exists now, the modern world that we live in. And so that's really the danger. So the process itself just tends towards thinking that you can arrive at truth democratically, which the Catholic Church would teach you cannot. We don't democratically choose the truth. We recognize the truth. We're drawn towards the truth. The Church, we believe, teaches things because she knows they're true. They're not true because the Church teaches them. And so that ought to be our approach. This is my same concern, I would say, with Episcopal conferences. They have a very important value, but really no juridical standing, in the sense that a bishop is the overseer of his own diocese. If the bishop next door thinks one thing, that doesn't mean he has to think it too, or that bishop's going to tell him what to do. Mm-hmm.
So, this is one of the things I think that is important to keep in mind is the Second Vatican Council paved the way for this sort of approach and for this sort of restoration of this ancient subsidiarity and solidarity among churches, and for it to be expressed, in this sort of synodal way. But at the same time, you have Dei Verbum, and you have an acknowledgement of Scripture's ultimate authority and binding sort of dogmatic role in the church. And you have these things in tandem, and they are not necessarily opposed, and that you can have a sort of dogmatic tradition that is genuinely passed along in a more decentralized, more responsive way that includes more people in the church, not to give necessarily leverage points for people with agendas, but in a general way to sort of, figure out how the church can best respond to the changing circumstances of the world in general, and then in the very diverse places in the world the church exists and is seeking to grow and further establish itself. Now, this was one of the other that's a messy business. That is just a fact of life. That's always been a messy business, and it will always be a messy business. And in this sense, Pope Francis is right that, you got to get your hands dirty and you have to make a mess just in the process of being the church in the world. And in response to that, Pope Francis exemplified a lot of times a very pastoral attitude that sometimes critics would find on individual issues too accommodating, and other critics would find it not accommodated enough. For instance, divorced and remarried Catholics and the sort of reception of communion is one of these examples, but not the only one. There have been letters from folks in interfaith marriages, and the Pope Francis has responded. With there's disputes about varying levels of authority, what this sort of pastoral advice means. But he's definitely concerned with addressing people on that individual level. What do you think are the ups and the downs to doing that? I mean, it's something that has to be done. We live in the real world, and people's situations in this world are very complicated. And any priest or pastor listening, any member of a parish council knows that life is messy. And that one of the things we're called to do as Christians is to work through this together and figure out a way that we can all grow closer to Christ where we can, when we can, and support each other in doing so. But that looks messy and was very often very publicly messy during Pope Francis's pontificate. What do the both of you make of that aspect of Pope Francis's legacy?
Well, so speaking from the historical standpoint, over the last couple of centuries, you're talking about overcoming a few centuries of cultural development where Catholics more and more have looked to the papacy and looked to Rome for direction due to anti-clerical movements in their own country, anti-Catholic movements in their own country, fallout from the Enlightenment, fallout before that, maybe from the Reformation, etc. And so what that means is there was a time period where if you were Catholic, you would know that there was a pope, and you probably wouldn't know his name. You might not know the name of your parish priest. Maybe you knew your bishop, but you had never met him. And this is not that long ago. And so how do you get over the idea that you should look to Rome for everything as a Catholic when it's Rome who's telling you that you need to get over the idea that you should look to Rome for everything as a Catholic? I mean, that's part of the challenge. So this would be the good side, I guess, of the Pope Francis's idea for synodality, and the way I should say the way synodality was treated. That is actual subsidiarity in the church. How do you somehow restore that or honor it so that you have the hierarchy, yes, and the truths, yes, but not an earthly authoritarian regime ruling from Rome? And I would just say you can't do that overnight, and it is going to be messy. But you have to be careful when you're making the mess to provide the moral clarity along the way. So if it appears that what you're really doing is reopening settled doctrinal teachings, that's not good. If you're saying, you know what, I still want to hear you, this is our teaching, but maybe there's another way we could say it or teach it or pastorally speak and reach out to you, then let's talk about it.
Yeah, I would echo some of those things that John said, and you had mentioned earlier that life is very complicated, And so, we talk about sin on the one hand, then there's private sin, there's public sin, there's public scandal. And I think, as John alluded to, you don't want to give the impression that settled doctrine or teaching or ethics are open for change. But you do want to protect the broader church from scandal and confusion. And at the same time, because life is complex, and because not only is there the objective standard of the law, but there's also the subjective degree of one's culpability, that's a very important pastoral consideration that I think Francis wanted to give more attention to. That we each have individuals that we know, and I'm sure any priest out there that's in the confessional day in and day out knows how complex people's situations are, and without compromising the objective truth of what's right and wrong, being able to attend to those people, all of whom we are, right? Mm-hmm. And depending upon the circumstance and the types of things that we're challenged with, and making sure that we don't neglect those people. And so I think that's really what Francis is trying to get at here, in making sure that, hey, look, I'm going to delegate some of this to pastors to assess.
So one of the things that Pope Francis has spoken out a lot about, and you mentioned, Catholics have looked to the papacy when they felt under siege, either by their own governments or even the broader culture. and you've talked about in your piece with Michael, John, Pope Francis has talked about ideological colonization and the need of the church to resist that. This is something that Pope Francis has been very strong on, has been very forceful on, and has been really, a key element of his papacy since the very beginning. This is a recurring thing that comes up when Pope Francis speaks about ideological colonization and the need for the church to resist this sort of ideological colonization. What is it that he's talking about, and what sort of support has he given people as they struggle through this sort of soup of conflicting and often, anti-Christian ideologies that are sort of loose in the world?
When the Pope uses this term ideological colonization, and I think it's a great term, we could say ideological imperialism, he's invariably referring to the West, even the post-Christian West of Europe, if you'd like to call it that, and the imposition of values that he says are anomalous and contrary to people's identity, contrary to their local culture, contrary to common sense, not just simply contrary to Christian doctrine, but just concept to nature and the natural law, and especially people's own culture. So we're all used to the old kind of colonization. This country A takes over this continent or country B and rules it from afar, expropriates the wealth. 500 soldiers push around 10 million people till they realize there's only 500 soldiers, and then they're out. I mean, that's the old imperialism. So this is a kind of ideological imperialism then. And I think I would agree with that critique 100%. Pope Francis used gender ideology as the example of what he called the worst form of ideological colonization. And he said it's the worst form because it muddies the waters of the difference between men and women, and because he said it attacks families. And so he gave this address in the Philippines in 2015, and Michael and I, in our eulogy, quote it at length because it's the kind of thing that I think many critics of Francis wouldn't even know that he said, because the BBC wouldn't report Francis's critique of ideology. Even the Wall Street Journal might not report it, okay? But it's there. He says, look, you got all these people in dire poverty, and on the other hand, you have these consumerist people. That kind of consumer mentality is one form of ideological colonization. But another is trying to redefine, he says, the very institution of marriage by relativism, culturally, being not open to life. He goes on to quote John Paul II about the family and basically says, when you're the future of humanity depends on the family, and if you threaten the family, you're threatening society itself. Now, one interesting thing that happened was when the Vatican put out Fiducia Supplicans, which addressed the possibility of blessing individual homosexuals, but clearly also implied that you'd be blessing homosexual unions and couples, not individuals, the Africans pushed back. In fact, one of those African Episcopal conferences pushed back, and Cardinal Mbongo of Kinshasa in the DRC called it Western imperialism. He said it's Western cultural imperialism. This stuff might be practiced in the West, he said, but it doesn't mesh with our culture, and especially when we're evangelizing in high Muslim areas and we're trying to explain the value of marriage between one man and one woman, it just makes evangelization harder, and it makes support for our cause more difficult. And the Vatican actually backed down. So it was interesting that even within the church then, unintentionally, I hope, there's this kind of ideological colonization that can sometimes come out of Europe and be pushed against the place where Catholicism's growing the fastest in the world, which is sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, there's an interesting, when you talk about this ideological colonization, there are all sorts of dimensions of it, and it's in tension with it shows how complex a global church can be, because this is intention. The intention before the pushback was a pastoral intention.
The Germans celebrated it, right? Yes.
Yep, and to accommodate people in Europe and North America and places like that have a very different context and a very different set of concerns. At the same time, one of the funny things, like this Economist obituary, which I kind of opened with, is very respectful of Francis throughout, except there is one point at which they go, well, he was against same-sex marriage, and he was against abortion, and he was against, gender ideology. But
The Economist also prominently promotes euthanasia of senior citizens and the infirm as well.
Yeah, and he was against female women's ordination and all of this. But he was okay for a Catholic. And the Economist's values are very much those Western values that he critiqued as ideological colonization. There is one really, really positive aspect of Francis's legacy that the thing that I would wake up in the morning, and if there was a controversy, and I was guaranteed to take Pope Francis's side, it was on ecumenicism. And he was deeply involved, deeply committed to this. We had our first commemoration ever in the history of the Roman Catholic Church of the Reformation. In 2017, he went to Sweden and commemorated the Reformation with folks from the Church of Sweden. And he said in one of those very famous sort of airport interviews that people would get worked up about, he said this about Martin Luther. He said, "I think that the intentions of Martin Luther were not mistaken. He was a reformer. Perhaps some methods were not correct. But in that time, the church was not exactly a model to imitate. There was corruption in the church. There was worldliness, attachment to money, to power, and this he protested. Then he was intelligent and took some steps towards justifying. And because of this, and today Lutherans, Catholics, Protestants, we all agree on the doctrine of justification. On this point, which is very important, he did not err. He made a medicine for the church." This is music to my ears. Pope Benedict XVI is someone who looked to actually the Lutheran confessions, to the Augsburg Confession in particular, as like the ground on which to build ecumenical work in the future. And out of this commemoration came a document called From Conflict to Communion, Lutheran Catholic Common Commemoration of the Reformation. This was a report of the Lutheran Roman Catholic Commission on Unity, which involved the Lutheran World Federation and the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity. And it's a remarkable document that takes a look at a very messy history of the Reformation and its legacy of violence, its legacy of division, and it says, there are different ways of reading this and remembering this. And one is a confrontational way, and the other is to look back on it and to try to draw on that tradition to move forward, to move closer together. And, this is one of those things that Pope Francis was, I think, very good on, and something that really, Lumen Gentium talks about how that the church is constituted and organized in the world as a society subsists in the Catholic Church, which is governed by the successor of Peter and the bishops in communion with him, although many elements of sanctification and of truth are found outside of its visible structure. These elements, as gifts belonging to the Church of Christ, are forces impelling towards Catholic unity, is that there are elements of sanctification and truth outside of the Catholic Church. And perhaps the most visible way that this was realized in Francis's papacy was when Gregory of Narek, who was named a doctor of the Church in 2016, Gregory of Narek was revered by Pope St. John Paul II, who cited him in social encyclicals, himself, who was called out as a great exemplar of prayer. but he was never in communion with the Catholic Church during his lifetime. He was a member of the Armenian Apostolic Church, which broke off is an Oriental Orthodox tradition, but is now someone that is honored for his contributions, his theological contributions, in sort of the greatest way that the saints can be honored in the Catholic Church. And, this was, if we go back, Dylan Palman, my colleague in the research department, reminded me this morning that in Laudato Si, Pope Francis cites favorably Patriarch Bartholomew, the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church. Or the ecumenical patriarch is, I think, the official title. I don't want angry Greeks. Angry Greeks can be frightening. But he was always welcoming to folks of other religious traditions, singled out folks' contributions, and sought to foster unity. And that was, I think, a really positive legacy, and one that, he shared in that vision a lot of what we try to do at the Acton Institute, which is to respect differences, acknowledge differences, but also realize that, we want to bring together people in genuine inquiry and genuine truth-seeking, and acknowledge that others that might be not of our religious tradition, can nonetheless lay claim to some truth and have genuine spiritual lives, even though they aren't, necessarily our co-religionists.
Yeah, a couple of things, just as full disclosure. I came out of a Calvinist tradition and am Catholic, so I've kind of on my own journey in looking at these specific differences between Catholicism and Protestantism. I think the things that we can say about what you just described from Pope Francis' attitude is just a continuation of your citation of Vatican II and its commitment to ecumenism, and then Ut Unum Sint of Pope John Paul II also doubled down on saying, yes, the Church is committed irrevocably to the ecumenical dialogue. I think there's a few things here. One is that, the Pope is tasked, among other things, to safeguard the teachings, right? Safeguard the tradition, scripture and sacred tradition, and to bring clarity when there needs to be clarity on matters of doctrine where there's disputes to serve the unity of the Church. At the same time, I think it is true, and we see it both in the dialogue that has existed for a while now between Catholic and Orthodox, Catholic and some of those Oriental churches that maybe broke off in the era of Nestorius or what have you, as well as Protestants more recently, is do we have differences that are also maybe differences in just understanding what we mean by our terms. Okay?
Yes.
So there are some of those things. Yeah, are we talking past each other? And so that takes, very astute theologians to go and look at all the nuances. You could think about the disputes of the filioque clause and things like that. So, I think that's an important project. At the same time, you want to make sure, as you referred to it, that we respect the genuine differences while they're there and not compromise or create ambiguities, right? Mm-hmm. And in some cases, the Church has seen disputes and said, look, we're not going to solve this, and it's not necessary to. So I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
There have been disputes between historically sort of Jesuits and Dominicans over the nature of predestination, right? And I forget which pope it was, but at one point the Pope basically said, stop arguing. It's a mystery, and we're only going to go so far into being able to answer that mystery of predestination and free will. And so it's really the Pope's authority that is able to sort of circumscribe, this is an issue we have to be right or wrong on, right? Mm-hmm. Or it disrupts our communion. Mm-hmm. And then these are the things that we can have legitimate differences, or these are the areas we need to still plumb what those differences are and see if we can come to a resolution.
This is why the Dominicans are our best soldiers in Calvinist outreach. And this is one of those things, when you talk about this terminological, there was part of the process for Gregory of Narok becoming a doctor of the Church was that a case had to be made that there was that the Chalcedonian definition was that whatever differences there were semantic rather than substantive. And there are sometimes substantive differences.
Right.
But there are also semantic differences. And this This is a lot of what the joint declaration back in 1993 between Catholics and Lutherans is parsing out. Where are the substantive differences? Where are the semantic differences? And again, it's a joint declaration. It's not a shared confession, which is very important to realize. And if you go in and you read that, it will talk about those areas that are just semantic, that theologians looking back retrospectively are like, this was just a genuine misunderstanding. And then there are those doctrinal distinctives, some of which still remain.
I don't have much to add to what Steve said other than I would throw into the mix historical differences, and Pope John Paul II talked a lot about that. That is, look, 500 years is a long time if we're simply talking about Protestants and Catholics in the West, and where doctrinally there might be convergence by now or near convergence where we could say this isn't that much different than Jesuits versus Dominicans on a particular topic. There's still 400 or 500 years of history and family tradition. And so on the one hand, you might say, okay, but if you go back far enough, your great something was probably Catholic. Well, but we're still talking about several centuries. And so I think fair enough that we never want to discount that cultural and historical heritage when we're talking about ecumenical activity. I would, however, my one caution is to recommend Pope Benedict XVI's Dominus Ieus, which made the splash in the press by those kind of people and the economists who would say, well, we like Pope Benedict, but we don't like this one. Because what he said was, to be a Christian, you really got to believe in Jesus Christ. And then he goes through the Apostles' Creed, and he says these things, and I think his point is, look, in fact, he says the constant missionary proclamation of the church is endangered by relativistic theories that seek to justify religious pluralism. He says not only on a de facto sense, where we're getting along and making common cause, but a de jure sense, as if there's no difference. But these differences are real.
Right.
And if truth is objective, then it's possible that somehow we're both a little bit right, but what does it also mean that the subsistence of the one Church of Christ is in the Catholic Church for Catholics? Right? What does that also mean? So there's that level of complexity that really shouldn't be lost, and at least the critics of Francis I have read would say that in those efforts, which are very laudable, and John Paul did them as well and was criticized for praying alongside Buddhists at Assisi, for instance, while those are laudable, especially the Bishop of Rome has to be very careful not to give the wrong impression.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a real challenge. How do you promote unity? How do you promote the fact that we're all grappling for the one truth which we were created to love and to know, and that draws us towards Him, right? But on the other hand, the doctrines also matter. And there may be that mysterious point beyond which we say, that's all I really have to know. And some people are more comfortable with mystery than others. Some people want to dot every I and cross every T, and some people can just, they go to church on Sunday, and that's cool.
Yeah. So as we're kind of coming to a close in our remembrance and our conversation, I guess I have sort of two closing questions. Is what do you think about Pope Francis's legacy? When you think about it, what do you think is going to be really enduring and really like something that will return again and again in the church? We've talked about, this continuity that Francis had in many ways with Benedict, with Pope John Paul II, with the Second Vatican Council. These are things that he kept returning to. What are the things that future popes will look back and will return to Francis to and seek to incorporate as they seek to shepherd the church forward? And then what are those things that you think that seemed like very, very important during Francis's papacy, but that are really sort of time-bound and tangential, and that, they won't be part of that enduring legacy in the same way, or they won't be revisited, again and again as the church unfolds and develops in the world.
So I guess I return to one of the things I mentioned early on, and that is his emphasis on the peripheries. Now, we see it, of course, in how he's appointed various bishops and cardinals, or bishops as cardinals in remote parts of the world, but also just the kinds of people that you just are outside of those processes or blessings that most people experience day in and day out. And I guess one of the things I think Pope Francis has impacted me, even here at Acton, we have homeless that will congregate outside of our building. I'll go back and forth to Mass at the cathedral downtown and pass a number of people who are clearly not having, life isn't working out for them like it's worked out for me.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, what each one of these people has a story, right? And I think it's very easy in just an ordinary walk of life. You get into your rhythms, you get into your habits, everything seems to be working okay. We all go through periods of suffering, but I think he's drawing a particular attention. Don't forget, there are people on the peripheries, and they all have a story, and we need to be bold to reach out to the margins and think about those people. So I think, every pope has that, affirms that, right? Mm-hmm. But Pope Francis, in his own unique way, in his own style, I think that will be an enduring part of his legacy.
I would agree with Steve. It's that reaching out to the poor, what we, Michael and I, in our eulogy call the pure religion of caring for the widow and the poor and the orphan. That Pope Francis has really, really emphasized that. A lot of people, we, like Steve's saying, similarly, we go about our daily business. We take care of our own family. We go to work. We're sleeping 7-8 hours a day. We're at work 7-8 hours a day. When we are concerned, we're usually writing a check, or we're saying, "Oh, that's so sad," or "Okay, I'll sign up for that volunteer opportunity." The harder work, in some ways, is what we try to connect those good intentions to at Acton, and that is to look at the broader and deeper causes of that material poverty and how we can assess that. So, but you first have to really know that it's there and feel it. And I think Pope Francis has done an excellent job with that. I mean, just speaking out about justice for the poor and the negative impact in market economies for those who are on the outside. And again, we might have a more positive view of market economies, but that's exactly what we need to continue to communicate so we can help those people flourish.
Yeah. Well, I hope we helped you flourish, listeners at home, and think through with us. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to think through with us the life and legacy of Pope Francis. There will be developments over the next weeks, maybe month, of the life of the church that we will return to, certainly on this podcast here at Acton Line. John, thank you so much. Steve, thank you both for your conversation today and for your written contributions. Steve on migration and Pope Francis, and John, you along with Michael with that remembrance. We will include links to both of those in the show notes.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you, Dan.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important because it lets us know what topics you are interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Mark Townsend.